Good morning. My name is Andrev, and I'll be talking about two literary theories. So let's start. Imagine yourself in a classroom thinking about or planning about the lesson. You have Alice in the Wonderland as your text, but you don't know what approach you will use in your lesson. You were thinking about asking the students on the elements of fiction and the elements of poetry. You thought maybe you'll just directly ask for the moral or the lesson of the story. Then you considered about just downright asking about their reaction regarding the story because you think those are common ones to do in your lesson. But then you thought about your students and you wanted them to have a more immersive experience on the text. And then you thought, okay, maybe I'll just use a literary approach in my lesson. But then you realize that there are a lot of approaches you could choose from. And first of all, what in the world is a literary approach? So, approaches in literary criticism or literary criticisms are simply tools we use to understand a literary text in a specific way or in a particular context. They're likened to lenses like contact lenses, like eye lenses, camera lenses. So sometimes we call them literary lenses because each approach could give you a different view on the text in hand. So if you use the certain approach, you could see a different view of the text or a different angle of the text. Or if you use another approach, you can see the text now again in a different angle or in a different way. So in this lesson, we will talk about two particular literary lenses or literary theory or we call literary approaches. So they are the historical and biographical approach. In this lesson, we will specifically differentiate historical and biographical literary approaches, discuss historical approach and its application in interpreting text, discuss biographical approach and its application in interpreting text. Next, we are going to enumerate activities that could be used under the approaches. And lastly, we will analyze the probable advantage and disadvantage of the two approaches. So those are our goals. Now, let's start by differentiating historical and biographical approach. So historical and biographical approach are two approaches in literary criticism that both looks into the underlying concepts, the culture, the society, the economy of the era that became the foundation of the text. And we will use these concepts to understand or interpret the text or to understand and interpret history. I think the foremost difference of the two approaches is their limit and focus. Taken separately, historical approach or the traditional historical approach is broader and uses the culture, tradition, and economy of the era to understand the text. On the other hand, the biographical approach is a more specific approach, which instead of looking into the happenings of the era, we narrow down the focus into the happenings in the life of the author, which could probably be the foundation of the text. So, in this approach, we use the author's life to understand or interpret the text. Now, let's talk particularly on historical approach. As mentioned earlier, historical approach is an approach that uses the happenings of the era or the historical background of the text to understand or interpret it. However, after decades of not being used because of writers or critics favoring the new approaches, the historical approach got a new name, which is we call new historicism or new historical approach. The new version of the approach simply claims that the relationship between the history and the text is not monolinear, but bilinear. This means that the history can't only be used to understand the text, but the text also can be used to understand history. So there's a vice versa relationship now between the text and history. In most literary classes, we always take into account the historical background of the text before we actually discuss the text. These are shown in backgrounders written at the start of the text in most literature books. However, the application of historical approach is really evident at the end of the text. But how do we really apply this approach? The easiest way to apply this approach is to ask the following questions when we analyze the text. So we can ask, when was the work written? When was it published? How was it received by the critics and public, and why? So you can also ask, how did the political events of the era influence what the writer wrote? What does the text tell about the political events of the era? How did the predominant social customs of the time influence the writer's outlook? And what does the text tell about the predominant social custom of the time? We can also ask, what is the predominant philosophy that influenced the work? And what does the predominant philosophy reflected in the text tell us about the philosophy and the beliefs of the era it was written? And lastly, we could ask, were there any special circumstance or events in history under which the work was written? And how do you think that it influenced the text? Are there any special events in history that are reflected in the text? What does it tell about these events? So if you can see in the highlighted words in the question, so first highlighted one is, yeah, the political events. We could ask about the political events. We could ask about the predominant social customs. We could ask about the predominant philosophy. Okay. And we could ask about the special circumstance or the special event that happened in history. Now, let's go back to the Alice in the Wonderland lesson. If we will use biographical approach to analyze this text, Alice in the Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, one of the things we can point out is the influence of of the drug addiction mania during the Victorian period to the narrative of Alice in the Wonderland. If you know, there was a time in Britain during the Victorian era that opium is very famous among British. They like using it. I am not yet sure if they know the bad side of using the drug, but yes, there was a time that opium is very famous in the Victorian era. And interestingly, that is shown in the story Alice in the Wonderland. If you were able to read the story or at least watch the film, it is clear that there are allusions of drugs or a symbolisms of drugs and addiction shown in the story, like the smoking caterpillar and the descriptions in the story that seems to be similar to people's experience when taking drugs. Now, let's move on with a biographical approach. So, yes, the biographical approach, to simply put it, is used to understand and interpret the text based on the philosophy and the experience of the author. Like the historical approach, the aspects of the biographical approach is attached in most of the literary classes and literary books we're in. Before the actual text, the background of the author is given first. So I think the historical approach and the biographical approach are pretty common and are pretty used in literary books, because as what I've noticed, before each story, most of the time there are always backgrounders. If not about the historical era where the text came from, it is about um the author of the text, so backgrounders. And I think that's a touch of these approaches in in our curriculum. Now let's continue. However, using the biographical approach in understanding a text goes beyond knowing the background of the author. The goal is to find and build connection between the author and the text. So that is the goal in when we use biographical approach. We need to find connection and build connection between, if we can find, if we cannot directly find connection, we need to build connection between the author and the text to understand, to understand the text, or to understand the author more. But the question is how? How do we use this approach? Like the historical approach, we can apply the biographical approach by simply asking or answering the following questions. So we could ask, what influences, like the people, ideas, movements, events evident in the writer's life, does the work reflect? So the influence in the writer's life that could be seen in the work. So we can ask about that. We can also ask, to what extent are the events described in the word a direct transfer of what happened in the writer's actual life? So there are instances that the incident in the story really happened in real life, in the real life experience of the writer. So we could ask how direct is the representation of the writer's life in the text is. Then we could also ask, what modifications of the actual events has the writer made in the literary work, for what possible purposes? So perhaps the writer really used a particular experience, but he changed some parts. So we could ask, why did the writer change some parts, and what could be his purpose in changing some parts of the story, and in changing some parts of the story, and incorporating some parts of his experience to the story. We could also ask, what are the effects of the difference between actual events and their literary transformation in the poem, story, play, or essay? We could also ask that, what has the author revealed in the work about his or her characteristics, mode of thought, perception, or emotion? What place does this work have in the artist's literary development and career? So these are the questions that we could ask when we apply this approach in analyzing text. Going back with the Alice in the Wonderland lesson, applying the approach could be narrowed down into the relationship of the text to the life of the author. So we could look into the relationship of Alice and the Wonderland, Alice in the Wonderland to the life of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, or most commonly known as, for his pen name, Lewis Carroll. Also, one of the things we can point out if we will use the approach is perhaps the similarity between the characteristics of the White Rabbit, the character in the story, and the characteristics of the author, Lewis Carroll. Here we could see that the author and the rabbit, interestingly, share the same characteristics. Okay, so as you see, they are both obsessed and afraid of losing their gloves. Now, here we can see one challenge in both of the approaches. Background research is really needed to successfully conduct the activity and the analysis. You know, we need to do background research to know the characteristics of the author, or the specific events that happened in the era when the text is written, to make connections. So the challenge is doing background research. So the students and even the teachers cannot and should not make any presumptions without at least doing a bit of researching. So that's a bit of a challenge when you use this approach. I mean, these approaches, the two approaches. So let's move on into classroom activities on historical and biographical approach. This time, let's talk about some of the activities that we can use in teaching under the historical and biographical theories or approaches. Guys, note that the teacher or we can revise these activity, we can improve it, or we can tailor it according to the needs and level of our students. So these are just samples of the activities. I know that um, you are very creative in thinking about activities um, in our lessons. So these are just samples some of the activities. So we could do picture talk, Janus figures. We have honored wanted poster, perspective page, talking heads, dialogue monologues or role plays, and we have charts, posters, infographics, and Venn diagrams. Those are some of the activities that we have. Those are some of the activities that we can apply in historical and biographical approaches. Now let's talk about the probable advantage and disadvantage of the two approaches. The need for prior researching, either in the part of the student or in the part of the teacher for preparation, could be one of the disadvantage of these approaches because, it's a hassle at times at kailangan mo pang mag-research para dyan. Kaya unlike the other approaches na hindi naman talaga kailangan na masyadong researching, though the two approaches, the biographical approach and the historical approach, are widely recognized and are encouraged in teaching, as what I said, most of the time, the history and the and the biography, the background of the historical background and the biographical background of the author is written before is introduced in the text also, so they're widely used. These two approaches are widely used and widely recognized. But these approaches, even though they're widely recognized, they're not free of criticism. Above all, the biographical approach is seen in a bad light with theories such as the death of the author. So let's talk a bit about the death of the author because this is a very important concept about related to biographical approach. The death of the author is a concept used by critics against the biographical approach. The proponents of the approach argues that the life and experience of the author should not be considered in analyzing and understanding a text because thou they believe that the interaction between the reader and the text is what creates the real meaning of the text. The meaning daw is within the reader lang talaga according to them. For them, each reader has different experiences and their experiences makes different interpretations of the work because according to the critics of biographical approach, um, readers interpret the text using their own experiences because of the uh, innumerable experience of the readers. There is multiplicity of interpretation. Iba-iba yung interpretation ng mga reader. So in this sense, the author's philosophy and experience is no longer needed to understand the text, holding the author like dead. Kasi hindi na kailangan yung experience niya para magkaroon ng interpretation or para magkaroon ng meaning ang text kasi yun nga, experience lang ni reader daw ang kailangan. Furthermore, theories propose that a great work is great if it can stand alone away from its author and away from its historical era. According to Manfred 1936, a Russian formalist, so this is a direct quote from him, the artifact or the text becomes separated from its creator, acquires life of its own. Now, to see the disadvantage and advantage of historical and biographical approach, we have this simplified table. So for the historical approach, its advantage is the approach enriches the reader's understanding of literature because of the knowledge of historical times in which that text is written. So yun nga, tama naman because the students could have deeper understanding and deeper appreciation of the text kung alam nila kung ano yung mga rason, ano yung mga pangyayari na naging basihan ng text. It works well for some texts which are obviously political or biographical in nature. There are really texts that are really close to politics and close to someone's life. Like for example, the No Limitang Here and El Filibusterismo, it's very close to politics. So we can right away use the historical approach to analyze the text kasi it tells really something. It really tells something about the era. So we could use the approach directly, the historical approach directly to analyze those kind of texts that really strongly represents the era when it was written. Next one, it places allusions in their proper classical, political, or biblical background. So in different texts, we have this literary device we call allusion. So allusions are indirect reference to things. So there are times na mahirap alamin kung ano ba talaga yung what does this allusion mean. So using the historical approach could help the students easily place the allusion. Okay. Kung ano yung reference na ginamin ng allusion na ito. So now let's move on to the disadvantage of the historical approach. It overlooks the literary elements and structure. So since our focus is the history, hindi na natin consider ang literary elements, which I think sometimes is also important. And another disadvantage is the author's individual contribution is not really focused. Even though they're related, if you just focus on historical approach, hindi ka masyadong nag-attach talaga sa life ni author. Mostly sa nangyayaring mga insidente sa history lang during that time and not to the contribution of the author. So now let's move on to the advantage of biographical approach. So let's move on to the biographical approach. The facts about the author's experience can help readers decide how to interpret the text. Readers can better appreciate a literary work for knowing the writer's struggles or difficulties in creating it. So, yun nga, because you know the background of the author, you will know how he struggled to write the text. Lastly, readers can better assess writers' preoccupations by studying the ways they modify and adjust their actual experience in their literary work. Readers can better assess writers' occupations by studying the ways they modify and adjust their actual experience in their literary work. So we can see, as I mentioned earlier, in under the biographical approach, there are times that the author uses his experiences but not directly. Meron siyang mga tinatanggal, meron siyang mga dinadagdag. So maybe we could explore more the personality of the author based sa mga idagdag and gitanggal niya sa mga story niya na related sa life niya. Now the disadvantage of the biographical approach, the approach tends to reduce art to the level of biography and make it relative to the times rather than universal. And lastly, it disregards the bigger concepts that affected the author and in turn the text. So the bigger concepts are the concepts during the historical era, like the predominance social customs, the predominant philosophies, and things like that. As a final note, I think the main goal of using the approaches, including the other approaches that will still be discussed, is actually to encourage the students to be critical and to ask more questions. Not settle on the surface level information, but to go deeper by asking what's, why's, and how's, and create connections between concepts. Simply, I think the goal of critical approaches to literary criticism or literary theory is to make our learners critical thinkers. So that is all, guys. Sorry for a very long discussion, and I hope you learned something. Thank you very much. Have a great day.